for joining this October edition of the Cannon Beach Library's Northwest Author Series. This time we'll be featuring author Karen Thompson Walker. My name is Doug Sagano. I'm a library volunteer. I write genre-bending novels. They're part dystopian fiction, part sci-fi, part psychological thrillers, and her works have been hailed as thought-provoking, haunting, and provocative. She is a New York Times bestselling author of two novels, The Dreamers, which was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award, and The Age of Miracles, which was named one of the best books of the year by the Financial Times, Publishers Weekly, People, the Oprah Magazine, and Amazon. Her work has been translated into 27 languages, and both of her books are in development for television. And I'd like to ask you about that a little bit later. Her TED Talk about fear and the imagination has been viewed by more than 2 million people. She's an assistant professor of creative writing at the U of O and lives with her husband and two daughters in Portland, Oregon. Welcome, Karen. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's really, really nice to be, even though I'm not in Cannon Beach, which would the only thing better would be if we were together in person. But it still feels nice that to be connecting with Cannon Beach, especially because I can't remember if I mentioned this to you, Doug, before, but my dad grew up in Astoria. So
Right.
I grew up, so we would visit every year, and I have spent a lot of time over the years, especially in childhood in Cannon Beach. So I just have the idea that I'm reaching a Cannon Beach community right now feels, kind of special to me. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. So, Karen, how did you get started as a writer?
Oh, well, let's see. I mean, I always loved, I loved reading and writing as a kid. But I think it was when I took creative writing classes in college at UCLA that I sort of started to take it really seriously and started to think, maybe I would like to try to really write stories and books myself in a serious way. I had two really wonderful teachers there, Mona Simpson and Amy Bender. And I feel like I still refer to things that they, in my own mind, things they taught me then. So anyway, that was a kind of a major turning point. And then I decided to do an MFA. So that's a master's program at Columbia in New York. And so then again, that was, I just learned so much from that workshopping process and meeting other young writers. And so that was the kind of main part of my path. And then once I finished that program, I needed a day job, but I wanted to do something that I hopefully would really love. And so I got involved in book publishing so that I was on the editorial side. So even if I wasn't writing the books, I felt excited to be, helping other people work on their books. And so I was on the editorial side in book publishing for about 6 years at Simon & Schuster. And I think that turned out to be, even though I thought of it as a sort of an alternate career path, and in case I never published books, it actually really, I think kind of deeply informed my own writing process and my own especially just learning to write novels. I think I learned so much from helping other, through the editorial process, helping other writers shape their books or help them understand where, at what moments was the pacing slowing down, or where was a character not feeling totally convincing, or where could we sharpen up the sentences. And then at a certain point I started to bring all that to my own writing process, I think. So I wrote my first novel, The Age of Miracles, in the mornings before work, while I was working as an editor. And then after I sold my book, that first book, I decided that the kind of temptation to write full time, or at least devote more time to writing, was just too great to keep a regular full time office job. And publishing just can kind of take over your life. So sort of with mixed feelings, I ended up leaving book publishing to focus on writing. And then at a certain point, I realized I really loved teaching. And so now that's what I still do have another job, but it's teaching creative writing. And I feel like that works better for me. But yeah, so maybe that was a long answer for how I got started. That's my whole journey almost.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting story. By the way, I'm a UCLA Bruin too.
Oh, really?
That's where I got my PhD in English.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah. Um, so what are some of your major influences as a writer? And you can talk about American writers or global writers,
Um,
YA authors or sci-fi writers. Yeah. What has influenced you the most in
the
your writing?
most. Yeah, I feel like yeah, as a child I really loved and a teenager I really loved stories that had like big sci-fi type premises or magical realist type premises like like Roald Dahl stories like The Witches or BFG, those kinds of things. But then at a certain point, like in late high school and definitely in college, I just really fell in love with writers like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, and I became very serious about modernism and realism and the kind of beauty of capture of reading about moment to moment human experience. And during that time, I think I sort of had this idea that was ran counter to these other types of books and stories that I love, that have like a big science fiction premise. But then I got over that and realized I think the big sort of for me a big I don't know, turning point or a spark was when I read in graduate school. I read Blindness by Jose Saramago, um, and in that book I just found it incredibly immersive, and it's a story of a mysterious contagion of blindness where everyone loses their sight within a few days or weeks in a city. And I just found it incredibly immersive, and it just showed me. I mean, clearly, there's so many like Kafka could have maybe done the same for me, but for me at that moment, that book, I just kind of snapped me into realizing that you could write something really serious and with big ideas and great sentences and interesting characters that also had a big almost science fiction like premise. So that was from then on, it really was that one book that I just sent me down a path that really changed the trajectory of my writing. I did an assignment related to that book where we had to write a story that had some unreal element, and that was the first time I'd ever tried to do that. And it turned out to be kind of like an early version of of the idea for my first novel. And so anyway, then from then on, I'd say sort of all of my work is that I'm trying to kind of combine those two loves of the big story and the, writers like James Joyce or Virginia Woolf or, more recent, like Marilyn Robinson is one of my favorites, and in many ways, what they're doing is totally different from what I'm doing. But what I try to draw on is that just like the appreciation of language, affinity for language and sentences and ordinary and everyday human experience. But then I'm also, putting all those things under the pressure of a kind of um, big, big premise. And so far, both of them have had a kind of science fiction big premise.
So do you consider yourself a sci-fi writer? I mean, because of your love for the big universal cosmic theme or problem, or do you consider yourself more of a straight ahead American fiction writer that likes to talk about everyday mundane reality?
Right. I mean, that question, I feel like that question comes up a lot. And I think for me, I almost feel like I don't want to be the one to answer it, because I think my one hesitation about calling myself a science fiction author is that I really don't come out of that tradition. And so people who are sometimes readers who are very big science fiction writers will feel like the way that my books unfold doesn't like there's not as much science. Maybe I should say what the premise. So the one, so that people can understand why this question would come up related to science. But my first book, The Age of Miracles, was one part a coming of age story, but it did have this. It was also a story about the rotation of the Earth suddenly slowing down and all the disasters that would ensue. And then my more recent book, The Dreamers, is about a mysterious, contagious virus, which I wrote before the pandemic and published before the pandemic. But anyway, so in both cases, there is, some science, but I like to write in these spaces where science hasn't yet necessarily figured everything out. And so as a way of like, there is science, but it's not going to be a book about, it's not like The Martian where you're going to understand everything there is to know about how this could be plausible. So that's a long way of saying that sometimes I feel like science fiction readers want more of that, and where my focus is really, what if we lay out this premise, and then how do the human beings respond, and how are their lives altered in big ways, but also small ways. And so I think I just try to draw on both of those. And I forgot to say, maybe one of my biggest influences in this sense is Kazuo Ishiguro, especially Never Let Me Go. And then now I just read Clara and the Sun recently, but that I feel like that's joined, for whatever books I write in the future, that one will influence me, because I think he does a really lovely job in those books with just sort of what I aspire to do, which is combining some kind of science fiction premise with a story that's really about the relationships between people, sort of what makes us human.
Do you have a passage you'd like to read for us today?
Yeah, sure.
My next question is actually going to be about your reflections on the Dreamers now that we're in the midst of a pandemic. Does your passage have anything to do with that, or should I ask that question, or should we go on?
I thought I would read sort of the opening to give. I think that helps set the stage of what the book is like, and the premise. And then I definitely would love to talk a bit more about the kind of uncanny experience of writing about a contagion and then having a major contagion come true. Okay, so this is just the beginning of the novel of The Dreamers. At first, they blame the air. It's an old idea, a poison in the ether, a danger carried in by the wind. A strange haze is seen drifting through town on that first night, the night the trouble begins. It arrives like weather, or like smoke, some say later, but no one can locate any fire. Some blame the drought, which has been bleeding away the lake for years and browning the air with dust. Whatever this is, it comes over them quietly, a sudden drowsiness, a closing of the eyes. Most of the victims are found in their beds, but there are some who will tell you that this sickness is not entirely new, that its cousins have sometimes visited ours. In certain letters from earlier centuries, you may find the occasional reference, decades apart, to a strange kind of slumber, a mysterious, persistent sleep. In 1935, 2 children went to bed in a Dust Bowl cabin and did not wake for 9 days. Some similar contagion once crept through a Mexican village, El Niente they called it, the nothing. And 3,000 years before that, a Greek poet described a string of strange deaths in a village near the sea. They died, he wrote, as if overcome by sleep, or, according to a second translation, as if drowned in a dream. This time it starts at the college. It starts with a girl leaving a party. She feels sick, she tells her friends, like a fever, she says, like the flu, and tired, too, as tired as she has ever felt in her life. The girl's roommate, May, will later recall waking to the sound of the key turning in the lock. May will remember the squeak of the springs in the dark as her roommate, her name is Kara, climbs into the bunk above hers. She seems drunk, this girl, the way she moves so slowly from door to bed. But the room is dim, and, as usual, they do not speak. In the morning, May sees that Kara has slept in her clothes. The narrow black heels of her boots are sticking out beneath the blankets of the upper bunk. But May has seen her do this once before. She is careful not to wake her as she dresses. She is quiet with her keys and with the door. May leaves only the lightest possible impression on this space, the comfort of not being seen. This is California, Santa Laura, 6 weeks into May's freshman year. May stays away from the room all day. She feels better this way, still stunned by how quickly it happened, how the friendships formed without her, a thick and sudden ice. Each evening, Kara and the other girls on the floor stand in towels in the bathroom, blocking the sinks as they lean toward the mirrors to line their lips and eyes. May can hear them laughing from the desk in her room across the hall, their voices loud above the hum of the blow dryers. It takes time to get to know people, her mother says over the phone. Sometimes it takes years. May spends her afternoons at a campus cafe, where, on this particular day in October, she waits until she is sure her roommate and the other girls will be gone from the floor, their hair dryers quiet, their flat irons cool, and the girls themselves enmeshed by then in the complicated rituals of their sororities. The boys, she hopes, will be at dinner. But when May gets back to the floor that night, 9 hours after she left it, she finds a note written in red on the whiteboard that hangs on their door. We're leaving, it says. Where are you? These words, it is obvious, are meant for her roommate. When May unlocks the door, she finds Kara still lying where she left her that morning, her body curled toward the wall in the top bunk, her black boots still protruding from the sheets. Kara, she says softly. Outside, the sun is sinking. The sky is clear and turning pink. May switches on the overhead light. Kara, she says again. But Kara does not wake, not to the sound of May's pleading or to the louder voices of the two paramedics who soon detect, through her badly wrinkled dress, that she is breathing at least, that she still has a pulse. Kara sleeps through the screaming of the other girls as they see the way her head rolls back against the stretcher, the way her mouth hangs open, her brown hair falling loose across her face. She sleeps through the screeching of the crickets in the pine trees outside and through the cool night air on her skin. May stands barefoot on the sidewalk as the paramedics slide the stretcher into the bright bubble of the ambulance. A little roughly, thinks May. Be careful, she wants to say. And then the doors swing shut without her, leaving May alone in the street. The paramedics will later report that the girl sleeps through the wail of the siren, too, and the flashing of the lights. She sleeps through the bumps of the potholed streets as the ambulance rushes towards St. Mary's, where, after several attempts, 2 doctors find that they cannot wake her either. On the other floors of the hospital that night, women labor while the girl sleeps. Babies are born while she sleeps. She sleeps while an old man in a distant room the old man dies in a distant room, an expected death. His family gathered, a chaplain. She sleeps through sunrise and she sleeps through sunset. And yet, in those first few hours, the doctors can find nothing else wrong. She looks like an ordinary girl sleeping ordinary sleep. There will be some confusion later about what happened to her there, how her heart could have slowed so much without setting off the monitors. But this much is known to be true. Over the course of many hours, her shallow breaths turn gradually shallower. It is hard to say afterward why the final beats of her heart go unrecorded by those machines. Thanks. So yeah, maybe that sets the stage that my contagion is my invented contagion is a contagion of sleep.
So, what are your reflections on our present COVID virus environment? I mean, now that you've kind of worked some things out in the Dreamers, but what things have struck you about our COVID world that you may or maybe that you may have anticipated in the Dreamers, and what things are you surprised about what we're currently going through?
Yeah, I mean, it has definitely been strange. I think at the part of my book that maybe uh, felt the most uncanny and that I thought through the most as an author is the beginning of a mysterious new virus. So I think for me, when this first like March 2020 is when it really felt like, especially before it became clear exactly sort of how we were going to respond and how far it would spread. There are just certain passages of the book that surprised me, like when I looked back, because things like there's lines like stores running out of face masks, or like the way that it travels through the news, or people not believing it, those kinds of things. And of course, they did feel uncanny to me, or like people visiting in the book, someone at a certain point, a man and his young baby visit, or try to see the wife and mother, who is asleep and, has caught the sickness and is unconscious, but they see her through a window. And, right at the beginning of the pandemic, pictures like that emerged of people visiting people in nursing homes just through windows. So there were moments like that that felt very strange, as if I had imagined, some of the things that were happening. And I think the real reason for that is just that, history tells us what history predicts the future. And so I'd done a lot of research into the history of pandemics and just kind of how they unfold and how people respond. So I think that's really the source of that. What felt uncanny to me is that. But then there certainly were a lot of things that I didn't I wasn't prepared for. I mean, I think one thing is I just did not realize that the world that we would the way that we would respond, and that we would have to respond this way, but also that we actually would, by like changing our entire lives. Like, I really didn't see that coming. I mean, even I remember when the early news was coming out that like that parts of China, they, like certain cities, that Wuhan or other cities had like completely locked down. I sort of associated it with like, oh, well, that's probably going to work, but that's an authoritarian government. Like, that's the way China would handle. Like, I didn't really realize that that we would all do that, and that we'd all need to do that. But I really did not. I didn't see that coming. Although in another way in the book, I mean, that is what they do in the town. Like, they do all start staying in their home. So maybe it's something about, I did all this research, but it was all directed to a novel, to an imaginative world that I control. And one choice I made is focusing on one town. And there is something that's true for the novelist who's inventing a reality, and for like all of us living through a real reality, that it's really a lot easier to manage the details of a sudden new virus if it can stay in one town and doesn't spread the entire through the entire world. So there was like a sort of a weird parallel there, that like I made a choice to focus on a small town and one small place. And it's too bad that pandemics obviously you can't usually keep them. I mean, it becomes a pandemic when it goes worldwide, but these kinds of viruses, usually we can't contain them the way that that I sort of did as an artist in my book. But I don't know that I have I don't know if I have so many thoughts that are different than other people's. But I think I also feel like I mean, I read so many books where experts were saying like that this is going to happen. I read about, books about 1918 influenza, and there's so many experts who have been saying for years and decades, it's going to happen again. It's going to happen again soon. But I think when I was in research mode, I put that right into my novel instead of fully, like, I still didn't really believe it. I mean, I not that I didn't believe them, but I just couldn't quite conceive of it, So I don't know that I was any more prepared than anyone else for just how hard, the experience has been.
Well, I don't see how anyone could be prepared for
Yeah.
for COVID. Have you had interesting reactions to your novel, The Dreamers, from other people who've read The Dreamers and are reflecting on our COVID time?
Yeah, it definitely, so the book came out in 2019, so really about a year, like exactly a year almost, before the first cases were discovered. So I think it really has, I'm glad it came out a year before, but it's really become tied up, like the trajectory of the book and people's reading experiences is really kind of become intertwined, I think. And some people, so I think at first people were like, who had read it before, were like, oh, I would hear from a lot of people that they kept thinking of the details in my book, which I should say, it really goes in a totally different way. Like, there's a reason probably why I didn't write about certainly not a coronavirus. And I also didn't choose influenza. Like, I wanted it to move beyond our regular real, the terrors of our regular real world, into kind of an imaginative territory. So it really does go in a different direction. But for a while, there are a lot of like, just now familiar parallels. so I think some people, like there's been some increased, like people who, especially at the beginning, people wanting to like just devour books that reflect or start to feel like they reflect reality. Like they had a new interest in reading about contagion and viruses. Um, but then there's other people who I think are like, they can't, like they pick it up and they're like, this is too similar to our reality. So I feel I've had both, but it definitely, yeah, it's been interesting to, yeah, it's been, I mean, yes, it has been intellectually interesting. I wish I didn't have that interesting parallel, but I mean, I wish that had not happened, but it has been interesting to have those kinds of conversations. And I've, some schools have done like pandemic literature courses. So I've gotten to speak to some classes in that type of context. That was sort of an interesting, like the fact that now everyone is an expert on viruses and on contagion and, that kind of stuff makes for different conversations than I would have had otherwise.
Right. I had the opportunity to see your TED Talk about fear in the imagination, and a lot of what you said in that talk applied quite directly to what we're going through now. Um, when I think about your two books, Age Miracles and The Dreamers, I also think about how different groups or different groups of people react to what's going on. So in the Age of Miracles, you have the real timers who, in spite of the earth slowing down, want to keep to what they would consider to be a more normal, natural cycle, right? And then in the Dreamers, you've got people who are outright deniers who'll say, "Oh, this is just a government conspiracy," blah 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 blah. And then you have people who are both in Age of Miracles and in the Dreamers who start hoarding, I believe. Tell us about your reflections on how we're fearfully responding or fearfully making decisions in this COVID age.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're right that I mean, I think the reason that there's a lot of, well, I've written two books about disaster, and they definitely grow out of it. I feel like I use the same. It's not exactly that I'm afraid of the two things or I was afraid of the two things, the exact things that I wrote about, but I do have a very like developed fear imagination, and I feel like the novels, it's like I'm using the same network of roads in my imaginative brain, to write fiction as I would otherwise, as I do also to try to, when I just think about reality or the future, and worry about it. So I do feel like my work is really intimately connected. And so in the TED Talk, the kind of idea behind it was that our fears are kind of, in a way, acts of creativity. It's your brain generating a story, an imaginative story, to tell you something about the future, what might be the future, and how, and so I think I have this idea that, that fears can, on the one hand, they can be this source of insight because it, obviously I think we all understand that, it's useful to have a fear response because you might, if you start to sense that a car is coming in some slightly mysterious way, the imagination of like getting hit by a car is what you take another look to see if there's a car coming, just to use a very simple example. So there's that useful version, but then, our fears can also lead us astray. If you listen to the wrong ones, or if you don't kind of apply critical thinking to your own fears. So I think living through COVID, I feel like it was a time where it wasn't, because I thought about my own, like when I wrote the TED Talk, it was easier for me to name examples of when is something that is irrational, an irrational fear that we shouldn't, it's understandable to have it, but don't listen to it, and, be reasonable. yeah, and that then what we should be listening to is like maybe more subtle ones, which at the time that I did the talk, I felt like climate change felt a little abstract in a way that it has now become much more. I feel like we're seeing it. And so I think it's moved into a different category in my sense. Instead of like, oh, an abstract thing that we're worrying about the future, it feels like actually something happening now. So that's changed some. But my point about COVID is that I feel like it wasn't so easy for me to tell. I mean, I think for anyone to tell what the reasonable thing was, at the reasonable response, like right at the very beginning, I was worried we were overreacting maybe. But then I quickly seemed like, no, actually, maybe we're underreacting. Like it was just like a moving situation. So it did make me I sort of had new ideas. It reminded me that you can't always know what the reasonable fear, I think applying critical thinking to your own fears, like that's the sort of kernel of the idea or the crux of the idea in my TED talk. I think that is still really useful, but there are some times when things are unfolding so quickly that even with the tools of critical thinking, looking at your fears, like whether something is reasonable, like how to respond and what the reasonable fear versus the irrational fear is can be hard to tell. My experience of COVID has felt like that often. So, but I think it's still useful to help. I don't know, maybe it did, having thought through those different kinds of fears maybe did leave me a little more able to take a step back, or I had thought through that, done the thought experiment before that, like, the question of like, can I leave, like, especially at the beginning, like, can I even leave my house versus can I maybe take the appropriate precautions and wear a mask and not get close to people? I could probably go for a walk. Whereas there might be an instinct, especially at the beginning, to be like, I can't even leave the house, So those would be the sort of two different kinds of fears. But I really did feel like there was much more murkiness in terms of what was because we just didn't know and nobody knew. And there still continues to some extent, that sense of the unknown is hard. It's hard to know which is the appropriate fear and which is the one that's maybe salacious and unhelpful.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to know. I think what's hard about our time is it's hard to know what is real knowledge and what is real science.
Yeah.
I
right.
mean, the FDA and the CDC will tell us all sorts of things, and then as COVID has been progressing and the agencies change their minds too.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and in a way, a mark of real science is that it's going to keep changing, but that's very hard.
Yeah.
It's very hard to live with that and listen to the recommendations when you're like, but remember before you discovered X, you said the other thing. It's very hard. Yeah.
Right. Do you have another passage you'd like to read to us? And it doesn't have to be, about COVID. It can be about anything.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, it did cross my mind. It might be interesting to read. Like, I have something, just some really short. Yeah, like here's a passage. It's pretty short, and it's one I, even before COVID, would sometimes read, but also I think it does kind of rhyme with our current reality, from sort of the middle of the book. So this is just as in the book, the virus starts on a college dorm floor, and then spreads out into the college town. So this is sort of in the early part of it's moved out into the town, but they don't quite understand it. They haven't quite fully tracked it. And it's just sort of half a page. Meanwhile, on that same night, in another part of town, the swirling sounds of an organ are streaming out into the street. A row of bridesmaids stands shivering outside a church. Every wedding after this one will be canceled or postponed, but this one goes through, the last vows to be said in this town. The bride has been feeling woozy all day. It's normal, her mother says, just nerves. And anyway, she was up so late the night before, finalizing the seating arrangements after a long day of work, a nurse in a doctor's office. No wonder she feels so tired. She does look a little pale, the bridesmaids agree, but 2 smears of blush put the color back into her face, and an extra layer of concealer hides the gray beneath her eyes. But whoever shares her lipstick that day, whoever borrows her eyeliner, whoever kisses her cheek that night, or dances too close, or clinks her flute of champagne, whoever touches her hand to admire the ring, whoever catches the bouquet at the end of the night, all of them, every one, is exposed. This is how the sickness travels best, through all the same channels as do fondness and friendship and love. I feel like I don't remember learning the phrase social distancing when I was researching, although I must have. Maybe I just didn't find it to be felicitous enough to want to use it. But I feel like it's my translation of social distancing right there.
Yeah, I remember that passage from the Dreamers really clearly because I thought, gee, that's exactly what we're going through. We're wondering, gee, what is safe to touch? What is safe to share? And I think the hard thing for all of us is just realizing that part of contagion is that something's contagious, and we can't. And no one can measure exactly just how contagious it is, or how communicable something can be.
Right. And different. I mean, that was a big part of research, was realizing that different viruses are contagious to different levels. I mean, I did early on feel like my research about measles. I remember this one detail was that if someone coughs in a room with measles, and then you walk through that room an hour later, you can get it. And that detail really stuck with me as I was writing my book. And in a way, I forgot to say this earlier, in a way, some of my research, as terrible as COVID-19 has been, in a way, my research, I did feel like I was able to imagine how it could have been even worse, even worse set of features for a virus. So we're lucky that my understanding is that COVID-19 is not quite as that probably you couldn't walk through a room an hour later, but I don't know. They are still always learning things. I feel like I was about to, I guess the other thing I'd say about contagion, before the pandemic, I used to say a lot about this book that one reason I was interested in and fascinated by contagion stories is that a story about a contagious disease is always also about relationships between people. Like the person who lives all alone in the woods is not going to be affected by these things. So I sort of loved that about as a concept to write about, how you could kind of track, like it's about a contagious illness, but it's in that, because of that, it's also about like then it passes from here to here to here, and all the ways that we interact. And so then I think obviously that's been a really heartbreaking part of especially the first year of COVID, like that we had to like the networks that we normally lean on when we're going through crises were all, it felt like weakened, or they were under threat because we couldn't see each other. So that felt like, that connection between contagion and our social networks. I mean literal, so not Facebook, literal social networks, or in real life social networks. It's just so heartbreaking that it's so intertwined, and that's certainly part of the history of contagious disease, that it's always been that way. Like the reason that we have them is because we live together,
Right. The other thing I find interesting about both of your books is that in a way, both of them are coming of age novels. Mm-hmm. So Age of Miracles focuses on it's Julia, right? Who's the main character,
right?
Delightful character. And in The Dreamers, it's more kind of a smaller group of college students. Why that particular age group? I mean, is it just because you have children, or is it because you find that's a way to reach particular kinds of readers?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, so yeah, I thought much more about how my first book, um, but you're right. It does that because it's the whole story is about a young person. But you're right with the college student. It definitely is another second kind of coming of age thing. And also, there's young in the Dreamers. There's also some young girls too who are um, young
Right.
sisters. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's has less. That part has more to do with my own memories of adolescence, and I
Mm.
just think it's kind of an interesting more than having children. Um, because now that I have children, I think I identify more with the parents, you know. So the Dreamers does also have like probably the most. It's mostly not very autobiographical, but the most autobiographical is just the experience. One of the parents has a newborn. They have a set of parents have a newborn baby, and just the experience of the first like 2 months of being a parent. I feel like that is like almost I got a lot of real details from when my daughter, who's now 7, that really comes right from my experience with her. But back to the coming of age stuff, I don't know. I think I just have a lot of vivid memories of that time in life, and there's something about that time where you still have the kind of sense of wonder and of childhood, and also everything you're doing is so much is still new. It's things are happening for the first time, um, and you're starting to have, but then I what I'm interested most is that transition. You're starting to be able to have some of the kinds of thoughts that adults have, but you still are connected to, yeah, the intensity and wonder of childhood. And I just find that to be a rich territory to spend time in fiction. Um, so yeah, I guess that's why I revisited it. I'm working on a new book, and I'm trying to think if there's a. It's definitely not classically coming of age, but I'm trying to think if there is some way that it has a little bit of there's a little backstory that involves that time. I mean, another one of my favorite novels is The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides, and I think what I love about that too is just how beautifully it gets at adolescence for all those same reasons. And maybe in general, I guess I do like books about young people. Um, yeah, another one of my favorites is When the Emperor Was Divine by Julia Otsuka.
Mhm.
And that's about, a family that goes to the Japanese internment camps. And it's told from different perspectives, but the parts that are told from a few different perspectives, the parts that are told from the children's perspectives, just I find particularly, yeah, arresting and vivid.
Hmm. Do you have another passage that you'd like to share with us?
Um, yeah, let's see. Maybe I'll do something I haven't talked about so much is this perspective, which is my first book was first person, and it was very kind of natural to figure out how a first person narrator functions, because we all tell our own personal stories from third person. Um, sorry, I'm having trouble finding this one, but the Dreamers, I realized once I decided to make it be this contagion story, and I wanted it to kind of wanted to, like I said before, chart sort of who gets the sickness next. I realized I wanted it to be third person so that I could inhabit a lot of different uh, characters, and then in that I started to play even go beyond the town. And so if I can find it, the passage I was thinking about reading is the the narrative voice kind of inhabits like how people are thinking about it from the outside. Although now I might not be able to find it. I thought I had it folded down. I'm going to give myself one more moment, and then otherwise I may switch passages. Oh, I found it. Okay, this one I think also sort of yeah, links up to our current reality. Okay. By now, certain alternate theories are beginning to circulate online. It's the government, they say, or it's big pharma. Some kind of germ must have gotten loose from a lab at the college. Think about it, they say. Do you really believe that a completely new virus would show up in the most powerful country on earth without scientists knowing exactly what it is? They probably engineered it themselves. They might be spreading this thing on purpose, testing out a biological weapon. They might be withholding the cure. Or maybe there's no sickness at all. That's what some have been posting online. Isn't Santa Laura the perfect location for a hoax? An isolated town surrounded by forest, only one road in and one road out. And those people you see on TV, those could be hired victims. Those could be crisis actors paid to play their parts. And the supposedly sick? Come on, how hard is it to pretend you're asleep? Maybe if you begin to say, Santa Laura is not even a real town. Has anyone ever heard of this place? And look it up. There's no such saint as Santa Laura. It's made up. The whole damn place is probably just a set on some back lot in Culver City. Don't those houses look a little too quaint? Don't be naive, say others. They don't need a set. All that footage is probably just streaming out of some editing room in the valley. If you look closely, you can tell that some of those houses repeat. Now just ask yourself, they say, who stands to benefit from all of this? It always comes back to money, right? The medical industrial complex. And who do you think pays the salaries of these so-called journalists reporting all this fake news? Just watch. In a few months, Big Pharma will be selling the vaccine. So that was a passage that I was, like I said before, with this third person voice. What I loved about it is that it felt really elastic. Like I could kind of go into all these different heads. And in this moment, I was sort of, kind of inhabiting the like message boards of people saying crazy things about the virus from the outside, which definitely I drew. It feels like I could have definitely written that after, like after COVID for sure. But I also was drawing that on, other kind, like 9/11 conspiracy theories. Like it just, comes right out of our world, I think, which is maybe obvious.
So in your third person narrative, what are you saying about conspiracy theories? I mean,
right there, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I think where it comes in the book, since if you're reading you're halfway through you're multiple. Sorry, looks like I have a child visitor. Hazel, this is my daughter. Okay, where? No. Just, I'm sorry, Hazel. Sorry about that. Where that passage comes in the book, I think the reader knows that the virus is real because you've experienced it along with the characters. And so taking this break for a moment, where they're like, and that the town is real, and so I hope that moment, you can feel that, like, someone who's not there. The problem is those people who think those things, especially, it's not a real town or whatever, that's because they're not here and they're indulging in their own conspiracy theories. Now, maybe the part about it's funny, like the part about like where it came from, I guess the book doesn't necessarily, maybe it doesn't answer that, but it's not my intention to make it seem like that's where it came from. I think it's all, I mean those things to be, especially the kinds of things people post on the internet as not based in reality.
Right. Can you share us a little bit about your next project and when we can expect to see it in print?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I haven't been saying very much about it yet, which is it's almost more for myself than it's not because it's like a secret. It's more like sometimes when I say my ideas out loud, I try to explain my ideas out loud when I'm in the middle of a project. It sort of takes something away from the dream of the book. Like somehow it doesn't sound, I mean, I don't know, somehow it bursts my own bubble of it or something. But I will say it's another story of of someone who's facing a kind of extreme and extraordinary disruption, but it's more of a personal catastrophe, and but it also has a speculative element. Like again, there's a mix of our reality with something that we have not encountered in our reality. And so that's, I mean, it's probably not going to be out for a couple of years because I have to finish writing it. So, maybe 2023, 2024. So it'll be a couple of years, especially because once I finish it, then it's still another year, so another year away.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm happy to give you the last word if you'd have anything that you'd like to end on.
Yeah, well, are there any, I don't know if there are audience questions, but if there were, I would be happy to answer any. Um, but I'm trying to think if there's anything else I should make sure to.
I don't think
um,
I don't think we have any yet.
okay, that's fine. Let me just make sure. I guess, yeah, I feel like we covered things. I think one thing we didn't talk about maybe so much is the setting. Both my books are set in California. And I think, yeah, I think that's sort of, I think that's an important part of my process, because something about living in a place, which Oregon, I guess, falls into this too, especially more recently, living with in a place where you're in touch with the risk of disaster feels like intimately connected to just my own imagination and the imaginative premises of both of my books. And I feel like, yeah, and that's why. So one thing that people are sometimes interested in is the Dreamers. I originally set it in Iowa City because that's where I was living at the time, and that's actually why I started writing in a college town. I mean, set in a college town, because I was living in a college town and I suddenly was sort of newly interested in college life. My own college life at that point had been 10 years earlier. Anyway, so I tried to set the book in Iowa, and I found that I just didn't know that place the way that I knew the place where I grew up. And so I moved the book back to California. But I feel like, yeah, that there's something about both books that the just knowing the climate and the feeling of especially what it's like to be young in California, and like a child in California, and what grows there and what the plants are like, and then plus the kind of specter of disaster, I feel like has been really key. And maybe it's interesting. I've been in Oregon for 4 years. It'll be interesting to see, yeah, if Oregon gradually seeps into my writing or not. But I think we share, unfortunately, that the disaster risk. So it's possible. But anyway, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I actually have a question.
Oh, okay.
Someone is asking why you killed the May character off
Oh
in the
no, gave it
Dreamers.
away.
So
That's okay. That's
hey,
all right.
it's not a
If you haven't
detective
read it,
thriller.
you'll forget that.
Yeah.
By now. Well, I mean, my books, like I set my books in obviously an unreal situations are happening, but I want them to follow the logic of reality, and so it's not that exact thing had to happen, but I feel like once I've made certain choices, like there need to be consequences, and if there were no consequences, it sort of undermines the reality of the premise that I put through, that I put forward. So
Mhm.
yeah, so I guess that's why. I mean, that's why there's this tragic consequence, because I hope that I mentioned before, Jose Saramago, he has this, he wrote about a concept that he called the possibility of the impossible. So even if he was writing a novel that had an invented imaginary premise, he still wanted it to follow logic, follow reality. And that's really important to me, to make it feel convincing and realistic at all times. And part of that is, having consequences. And I can't always give every character a happy ending, because then that's not reality.
Right. And we have one more question. Another listener wants to know if any of your characters were based on people you actually know, not that you have to name names.
um I mean, of course, like writers are always like, you're always like absorbing, everything, including the personalities and character traits of people around you. But there aren't. I would say the only character I've ever written that is directly based on someone is the newborn, the newborn baby. That was exactly, And then otherwise, of course, I'm like taking little pieces, little bits of people's personalities, but there's not like, there isn't really, yeah, there isn't really like a certain, no one is based on a certain person. I mean, maybe Julia in The Age of Miracles, her personality, I drew a lot on like my memory of what it felt like to be that age, and the sort of like to be like a little tentative and nervous and shy and socially like worried about friendships, like that. Those feelings definitely come from my own like maybe 12-year-old self. But then the events in her life are all made up.
Right.
And
Walker,
I would never want to write, I would never, I would never want to write a character that was exact, like where the person was knew that it was that, like that. That feels I think it would be like it would distract from my imaginative life to be worried about what they're going to think. So yeah, so I take personality traits sometimes, but it's not, they aren't really people that I know.
right.
So that's interesting that you went to UCLA. Maybe we might know some like, I don't know, if some of my professors would have crossed paths.
I'm sure we might. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, Karen, thank you for your time. This is really, really interesting. And I think you're going to have some new readers for both your novels. And we look forward to your new novel that should be coming out shortly in a year or two.
Yeah, sort of,
right?
shortly. Well, thank you so much
thank
for having me. It was really nice, and hopefully I'll make it to the Cannon Beach Library in person some other day.
Well, please come and visit us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thanks for doing this.
You're welcome.